But up next, the iconic 70s rock group, The Cars, sold over 30 million albums worldwide, and in the process earned 17 top 40 hits. My next guest has been a music journalist, an editor, as well as a website publisher, and the author of a brand new book titled Let's Go, Benjamin Orr and the Cars. We're pleased to have Joe Milliken join us on the telephone. Mr. Milliken, good evening.
Hey, how you doing?
Terrific.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate you joining us. Thank you. Your book deals not only with the group itself, the Cars, but also in particular with Benjamin Orr, one of the co-founders of the Cars. He was born in Lakewood, Ohio, of Polish, Russian, Czechoslovakian, and German descent. Tell me briefly about his youth. What was his young years like?
Well, this is a biography about Benjamin's life. So it's not necessarily a Cars book. It is indeed a biography about Benjamin. And, he was born in Ohio and a Cleveland resident. And what I can tell you about Ben was he wanted to be a rock star as early as he could remember in life. I mean, he was in his first band at age 13. And he knew from the get-go that he wanted to be a rock star, and he was determined to do that. And he definitely succeeded, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Were his parents influential in him achieving that success? Were they supportive?
Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, Ben actually quit school in high school as a sophomore. He wanted to concentrate solely on his music. And his parents were also loved entertainment, and they were singers and dancers in their own right. So they loved the fact that Ben was a singer and an entertainer. And when Ben decided to leave school to pursue music as a full-time thing, they were very supportive of him. So yes, indeed, they were very influential in the early days of Ben's success, for sure.
What were some of his early musical influences?
Well, Ben was a big Elvis fan. He loved Elvis from an early age. As a matter of fact, there is a story about how when he was really young, I mean, we're talking 5 or 6 years old, his parents would have friends over to their house, and Ben would actually entertain his parents and their friends in the living room by singing Elvis songs. So Elvis was a big influence for him early on. He also loved Roy Orbison, loved his voice. So Roy Orbison was a big influence. And of course, as he got a little older, in his later teen years, when the Beatles and the British invasion hit the music scene, he was highly influenced by that too. He was a very big Beatles fan and loved the British invasion bands as well.
When we talk about a voice, Benjamin Orr had a phenomenal voice himself.
Oh, absolutely. He's truly one of the iconic rock voices there are. I mean, for me, he's right up there with Paul McCartney, David Bowie, Paul Rodgers of Bad Company. Those are a couple of iconic voices that come to my mind, and Ben is right up there with them as far as I'm concerned. And he definitely an iconic voice, no question about it.
His first band was started in 1965. It was a band called the Grasshoppers. They also did some television, which I didn't know.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because that was one of the reasons why I decided to write about Ben. I was a published writer for about 20 years or so, but it was all newspapers and magazines. So when I was thinking about what I was going to write for my first book, it was brought to my attention by a Cars fan that I should look into writing a book about Ben. And certainly that was a big influence on my deciding to do that. And he was huge in that regard, for sure.
Here with KW Magazine on FM 98.5 CKWR. Guest is Joe Milliken, a music journalist and editor and the author of Let's Go, Benjamin Orr, and The Cars. When did he first meet Rick Ocasek, the future leader of The Cars?
He met Rick early on. As a matter of fact, Rick his family moved to Cleveland when he was in his late teens. And Rick lived in Columbus, Ohio, which was near Cleveland. And so they were both in local bands in that area and playing around, and they met each other a few times at parties and concerts and things of that nature. So, that's how they hooked up early on. And they actually ended up in a basement together in a party with some instruments hanging around. And they played some songs for each other. And Ben actually played a Beatles song for him on an acoustic guitar. And Rick is quoted as saying that it was the greatest voice he had ever heard. And they were partners from then on until they became famous. So they actually met each other early on in Cleveland, probably about a decade before they moved to Boston and got their first record deal. So they connected early on and formed a partnership about a decade before the Cars actually made it big.
In fact, they went through several different bands, different names, interesting names. Milkwood, it was a folk band, also Richard and the Roberts. The name The Cars, any idea how that came about?
Well, when the band actually formed in Boston and they got all the members together that would be in the Cars, they were actually a band called Cat and Swing. And they were playing in bars in the Boston area around that time. And when David Robinson, the drummer, joined the band, he pretty much said, "Well, I've had this band name in my head for a long time, just waiting for it to come out and waiting for the right moment to use it." And David Robinson was the one who introduced the name to the band, and obviously they all loved it. So it just happened to be a name that the drummer had in his head for a long time and was just waiting for the opportunity to bring it out. And it definitely worked perfectly.
Indeed. Now, they went on, as I mentioned off the top, to sell some 30 million albums worldwide. They had 15 Billboard Top 40 hits. What do you think was behind the success of this band?
Well, I think that one of the big things is that they had such a unique sound. At the time, the Boston music scene was very eclectic, and there were Boston is a big college town, so there's a lot of bars and opportunities for local bands to play. And they actually started playing in a club called The Rat, which is pretty famous. The Rat is almost like the CBGBs of Boston, if you will. It's an iconic venue where a lot of bands got their start. And the Cars started playing at the Rat, but at the time it was kind of the punk scene, so there were a lot of punk bands playing in the Rat and around Boston at the time. So the Cars kind of got lumped into that category because they were also playing at the Rat, but they really weren't a punk band, obviously, and they had a very unique sound, and nobody sounded like them, and I think that was a big part of the reason why they were noticed early on, just because they had such a unique sound and nobody really sounded like them. So, yeah.
Now, their debut album was extremely successful, but within a very short period of time, that success turned into some serious challenges for Orr. They ran into members of the band leaving. How did they deal with all of that?
Well, they had a pretty success. I mean, for about a decade strong, they were pretty successful. Obviously, multi-platinum albums and that kind of thing. But they actually they were together until they broke up in the end. I mean, they were together for a decade and created a lot of hits And over time, you know, things just kind of, it was a combination of things. Popularity, royalties, songwriting. You know, if you're around a bunch of the same bandmates for a certain period of time, you know, conflict is going to arise eventually. It's like being in a family, you know. And so that's kind of what happened with them. They were a very successful band for a decade. I also think as the 90s hit, music genres were changing. It was heading more towards the grunge scene, so that kind of played a part in their popularity sort of fading away, if you will, as with a lot of 80s bands, for sure.
Joe Milliken is our guest. He's the author of a new book titled Let's Go, Benjamin Orr and the Cars. You pulled together this book as a result of numerous interviews with a huge number of family members, friends, bandmates. What did you find out about Benjamin Orr that surprised you the most?
What surprised me the most? Well, I think that one of the things that surprised me is that Ben was sort of the heartthrob of the band. He was, you know, good-looking guy, co-lead singer, a lot of charisma on stage. But I learned through all these interviews with many people who knew him that he sort of flipped a switch when he went on stage. He flipped the switch to become a rock star, but when he came off stage, he sort of flipped that switch off. He was actually a very private man in his personal life. He was quiet, reserved, didn't look for the spotlight. So you see this rock star on stage, and you think that it's a person who seeks the spotlight, if you will. And Ben really wasn't like that. He was a very private guy off stage, so that kind of surprised me. Another thing that seemed to be a common thread through all the interviews I did was that he was a very loyal guy, too. You know, I mentioned he was originally from Cleveland, but even after he moved to Boston and the band became world famous, whenever they would go on tour, he would always get in touch with his friends that he grew up with in Cleveland, like bandmates from in his younger days. And he would get a hold of his friends and tell them he was coming to town, and he would get them concert tickets for the Cars shows and backstage passes and get them limousine rides to and from the show. Wouldn't let any of his friends pay, you know, spend a dime. He was a very loyal guy, and even after he became world famous, he never forgot where he came from, and I thought that was a very unique thing for a rock star to not forget his friends and remember where he came from.
I mean, one of the things that you point out in the book along those lines is that he was very kind-hearted, very generous, and as you say, never forgot his roots.
Absolutely. And that is I mean, I interviewed over 120 people for this book, spanning his entire life, and that really seemed to be a common thread, was that he was very loyal and generous and didn't seek out the spotlight. When he did things for people, he didn't want it to necessarily be known. He was just a very generous, kind-hearted guy, for sure.
Once the Cars disbanded, he went on to be part of a supergroup called Big People. Tell us briefly how that came about.
Yeah, after the Cars broke up, Ben had a solo band for a few years. He sold his house in Vermont, in Boston, and moved to Vermont, and he started his own solo band. And while he was doing that thing, he got a call one day from Derek St. Holmes, who was one of the guitar players in Big People and is well known for his time with the Ted Nugent Band. And he got a call from Derek out of the blue and said, "Hey, me and a couple of guys are putting this band together, and we would love you to come down and hang out with us and audition and see if you'd be interested in playing with us." So we had also in the band was David Carlisi of 38 Special, was one of the guitar players, and Liberty DeVito, who was the drummer for Billy Joel for many years, was the drummer in the band. So they just kind of contacted Ben out of the blue and said, you know, we're putting this band together. Why don't you come down and check it out? And Ben went down to Atlanta, and they all clicked, and that's kind of how Big People started.
Mm-hmm. In early April of 2000, Benjamin Orr was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Yet he continued to perform sort of off and on for part of that summer, didn't he?
He absolutely did. When Ben was diagnosed with cancer, Big People had already done some shows. They did a tour warming up for Styx. So they were starting to build momentum, and they were actually getting interest from record companies, and they were getting ready to try to sign a record deal and write some new songs and put an album out. So Big People was definitely gaining momentum when Ben was diagnosed, and they had already actually booked a whole bunch of concert shows. They had a tour all set up. But Ben said, you know what, I'm going to play until I can't play anymore. And he was determined to carry out with that tour. And he actually, I mean, the last show he ever performed before he passed away was literally just a couple of weeks before he passed away. Mm-hmm. So he was born to be a rock star. That's all he ever wanted to do. And he wanted to do that until he couldn't do it anymore. And he literally did that. I mean, 2 weeks before he passed away, he was still on stage performing, doing what he loved to do.
He, in fact, passed away at 53, far too young in October of that year of 2000. Some 18 years later, the Cars were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. If he was alive now, how do you think he'd feel? What would he say?
Oh, he would be so proud. I actually attended the ceremony. I went to Cleveland, and I was in the building when the Cars were inducted into the Rock Hall, so it was a thrill to be there. And because Ben is from Cleveland, it was basically, you know, coming home for him. And another interesting note is that I have done some research on this, and I guess I can't guarantee it 100%, but for the research I've done, Ben, I believe, is the first Cleveland native to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. There were a couple of Ohio natives that were inducted, such as Chrissie Hynde of the Pretenders. But Ben, I believe, is the first native Clevelander to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which, of course, is also in Cleveland. Mm-hmm. So it was really a coming home for Ben. And I, like I said, I attended the ceremony, and the day before the Rock Hall ceremony, there was a media day at the Rock Hall, and I got to do some radio interviews and talk about my book a little bit. And there were literally fans coming up to me and acknowledging that I was writing this book about Ben, and they were giving me hugs and thanking me for writing this book. So Cleveland has a special place in their heart for Ben, and it was really an amazing experience for me to be there and to observe the Cars getting inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It was a pretty amazing thing.
Joe, I have about 30 seconds. Their music continues to be relevant today, obviously, with new fans. Why do you think that is? I
think their music has lasted this long simply because they were unique and different. I mean, they're labeled as I've heard them labeled as a classic rock band. I've heard them labeled as a punk band. I've heard them labeled as a pop band. It's really all those things combined. And to this day, I have yet to hear a band that sounds anything like the Cars. They are just unique unto themselves, and I think that really is a big reason or a big part of why they've had such longevity, because nobody sounds like the Cars. The Cars come on the radio, and if you know that band, you know it's the Cars right away. So I think just the fact that they were so unique and nobody else sounded like them, I think that plays a big part in why their music is just timeless in rock and roll.
Joe, good of you to join us tonight. We certainly appreciated this conversation. All the best to you.
Oh, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Have a terrific evening. Journalist Joe Milliken is the author of Let's Go, Benjamin Orr, and the Cars. This is KW Magazine on FM 98.5 CKWR. And this is